Welcome to the recording of the webinar Co-Shaping Evaluation in Citizen Science towards more participatory approaches in evaluation of citizen science. The webinar was recorded on January 27 in 2021. We organized it in the framework of the European Union project CoAct in cooperation with the European Citizen Science Association EXA and the project EU Citizen Science.
The objectives for today are we want to learn from our peers. I already said that. We want to think together why more participation is good for evaluation. We think we need a better understanding of how to give voice to the stakeholders of an intervention and its evaluation design. So already in the design of the evaluation, but also then in the process and in the results of the evaluation. So we want to provide you with a brief overview of participatory, but also other evaluation methods in citizen science so far. And we want to introduce you to our approach to co-evaluation today. And the idea really is that we can learn most from each other. So the mutual learning and the discussing of experiences can help us, especially nowadays when we are in the middle of a global crisis and when we have the problems of physical distancing and that traditional evaluation or participatory evaluation strategies don't work so well in the digital domain or in times when, you need to distance and you need to be sure not to create too much social interactions on the ground. So before we start, we just wanted to introduce you briefly to the project which is hosting this webinar. It's called CoAct, Co-Designing Citizen Social Science for Collective Action. It started in 2020 and is funded by the European Commission under the Science Within for Society program. In this project, which will go for 3 years, we work in citizen social science. I come back to that term. That is especially designed and directly driven by citizen groups that are sharing a social concern. We regard the participants as equal, as co-researchers on an equal footing, and we want to bring together and further develop methods to give citizen groups an equal seat at the table, if you like. And there are 4 what we call research and innovation actions, more or less case studies. There is one from Barcelona. Hi there, colleagues from Barcelona, the mental health care project. We will hear a little bit more about it later. Then we have a case study in Vienna on youth employment, and one more in Buenos Aires on environmental justice, and then one that is already only starting this year with a call on gender equality. So this is so far from the CoAct project. Just to come back to this idea of citizen social science briefly. So we want to take the best of citizen science and the best of participatory action research, if you like, and bring it together to learn more how to design the whole research cycle in a better and more participatory way. And so you can see, I'm not going to read all that. You will get the slides anyway. So the idea is really to stick with the best principles of both worlds and bring them together. And there is actually a lot to bring together. So both worlds can learn from each other a lot. That is what we think. So before I continue speaking, I want to introduce you to my 3 colleagues who are already waiting to engage with you here. They have co-organized this webinar together with me. First of all, there's Steffi in the background. She's organizing everything. She is like having the technical lead, and she sends out the info. She does the communication. Thank you, Steffi, for all that. And then there is my other 2 colleagues, Barbara Kieslinger and Teresa Schäfer, who are now going to present you a brief overview about what we know on participatory evaluation in citizen science so far, before we come to the idea of CoAct. I'm not going to introduce them with their short CVs because you can read them in the workbook and time is precious. I hope you are okay with that, Barbara and Teresa, and we just directly jump into the topic. And yeah, I give you the word.
Thank you very much, Katja. Yes, actually, we thought before going into the details of co-evaluation, we wanted to give a little bit of an insight into what is already going on in terms of evaluation in citizen science. And actually, this is a very hot topic, I would say. Just last week, there was also a meeting with 16 European funded projects on citizen science, and impact assessment was one of the core topics being discussed there. And there are actually, even at European level, specific projects just dedicated to developing evaluation and impact assessment frameworks for citizen science. So basically, there is already quite a lot out there. I mean, there are evaluation frameworks that are based on the logic model of evaluation, which comes more from the developmental areas, but has been adapted widely, where you look into the input, activities, output, and outcomes and impact, which is partly can be applied to citizen science, partly it's difficult, especially again when it comes to the outcomes and impact assessment. There is a good model, I would say, a widely used model on targeting specifically or evaluating specifically learning outcomes that has been widely spread and comes from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in the US. Or we have certain embedded models where people are not even, in terms of methods, where people aren't really aware that they're being assessed or contributing to the evaluation, so to say. And then we have also models that are more inspired already by participatory approaches, and for example by designing ethics in that sense, also evaluation and from the users or from all the participants into the design of the whole project. And we have, without going into detail, we have summarized this in a recent publication that just came out. It's this book called The Science of Citizen Science, where we have one chapter dedicated specifically to evaluation in citizen science, the art of tracing a moving target, we call it. Thank you, Katja. The next one. For us, we have developed this model of evaluation for citizen science together with some other colleagues working for a long time in citizen science. And it was helpful for us to divide it into 3 dimensions and in 2 types of so to say, on the one hand, focusing on the process and on how it is being designed and set up a citizen science project, and where evaluation should already be considered, and also in the outcomes and the impact. So that's more related to impact assessment. And there we have these 3 dimensions, which have later been developed then by others into more dimensions, and we have references to that in the reference section. But basically, we said let's look at the scientific part of citizen science projects. Let's look at the individual participants, you know, the researchers, the co-researchers, the citizens, everybody involved. How are they affected by participating in citizen science? And then the wider context, so they call the socio-ecological and economic aspects as well, and policy would fall in that as well, for example. So I would actually hand over to Teresa, who goes a little bit into more detail in all of these dimensions.
Yeah, hello. So actually what we did in this book chapter that Barbara was mentioning is we looked in how far are these dimensions already evaluated at the time being for citizen science. So I will start with the scientific dimension. And if you look at this dimension, we see that the numbers of publications are, of course, the widest applied indicator that is collected at the moment by citizen science projects. And we see that we have the highest numbers of publication in the traditional natural science fields, and for big online citizen science projects like Galaxy Zoo or Folded. And we also see that there are lower numbers in humanities, but have to see this very critically, because maybe especially these grassroots bottom-up projects do not publish so much in scientific publications, but rather in newspapers, television, and so on. So, but this is the mostly applied indicator that is collected. But we also have other indicators that would cover the scientific dimension, but we only see some selected studies that try to bring evidence for these kind of other, let's say, outcomes for science, which is, for instance, the trustful relationship between members of the society and the scientific community, or an enhanced capacity to work together. Then on the next slide, we have the participants dimension, and certainly the learning effects on individuals are the things that are most oftenly evaluated at the time being. So we see quite a lot of studies that bring evidence for an increased content knowledge. It means that individuals learn about the subject of the scientific investigation. And we also find some studies that bring evidence for an increased scientific literacy. But then if we look at additional, let's say, aspects of learning, then we again see rather a smaller number of studies that try to address these aspects. That is, for instance, an increased sense of empowerment, or let's say higher civic activism in the form of political the influence in political decision making, or reflecting one's own values and interests. So these are aspects that can be found in some of the studies, but they are only collected anecdotically. But of course, then we have the socio-ecological and economic dimension, and here this is the dimension that is most difficult to let's say, evaluate. And what we find here is that we see individual outcomes, learning outcomes that cascade for whole regions and communities. So the individuals act as promoters for a scientific project or a subject, and involve their whole networks, whole communities. They collaboratively, together, raise political participation. And we see some really interesting also air quality citizen science projects in Europe that try to also cover these aspects and find evidence for positive effects, for instance, on air pollution by influencing political decisions and the way how infrastructures are built into city and parks and so on. So this is this is just at the beginning of really being evaluated, but we see that there's also something going on. At the next slide, we have looked into current practices and tools on how is citizen science evaluated at the moment. And of course, most often we find surveys and interviews, like for the learning outcomes, for instance, the pre and post surveys, but also interviews to gather benefits and motivations. But we also see some more, let's say, other tools like narrative interviews that are combined with research diaries or storyboards, or an embedded assessment, as Barbara was mentioning, where the citizen scientists, as part of their activity, get more playfully involved in quizzes and so on, and they do not even realize that their skills and so on are evaluated. Okay.
Okay, so should I take over?
Yeah.
So as you can see, a lot of things are missing when you come from activism or participatory action research, and we are asking ourselves, how can we construct a project that is thinking participation as a whole? What about integrating multiple perspectives in the design of the evaluation strategy already from the beginning, and in the choice and maybe also design of the evaluation instruments. And with that, creating a more socially robust project, because this is what we think. We think when you think participation as a whole, you will create definitely a socially more robust project with more benefits for the stakeholders, because they will, for the different groups of stakeholders on the different dimensions that Barbara and Teresa have just shown you. Hello, why is it not working? Sorry. So this is why we have come up, and of course we were not the first ones, but why we are kind of now adopting or newly inscribing the term of co-evaluation. We understand it as a form of participatory evaluation that initiates the conversation on expectations, objectives, and impact already at the start of the project, or even before in the design of a project. With a lot of different stakeholders, and later on also with a lot of different participants in the project. So the right point to do this, or at least one of the points in the research cycle to do this, is when the forms and formats of participation of actors are negotiated. Best of all worlds, of course, when they are negotiated collaboratively, and not when top-down research design is thinking about how they can participate. Of course, we have to think about that because we most of the cases that we have in our project, they come from community groups, communities of practice, people who already have and share a social concern. So, and sometimes there have been activities for more than 20 years that now our project comes and builds on. So there has been a lot of social activism going on and not so much of science. So this is why it's so important to negotiate those kind of forms and formats of participation at one point in time. And of course, maybe to leave it flexible for later, but we'll come back to that. So the main difference between co-evaluation and conventional types of research evaluation is, and it's very simple, that participants are also involved in the decision on project goals and the evaluation instruments. And we want to learn from other fields. That's what I already said at the beginning. So, and participatory evaluation has already quite a long tradition in development, in developmental studies, in program design, in a lot of those fields, as we will hear also later in the panel discussion. So we can say that we are basing our thoughts on all types of participatory evaluation that are characterized by a research process based on partnership between the evaluators and those actors who were part of the research process, or even becoming evaluators themselves. Because many of them have to put the results into practice, and this is why it's so important to engage with them already on the thinking about impact from the beginning. Yeah. So but there's not only impact, of course, as one of the objectives. The one other objective is to initiate and facilitate learning, and therefore also focusing on the processes of the project themselves. Co-evaluation is inspired by many things, and yeah, we could talk for hours about this on a more epistemological level, but I want to pick out two that I always show to the audience when I present co-evaluation. One is definitely participatory action research. I've already mentioned it, where with the concept of co-researchers that tries to understand co-researchers as equal participants on an equal level with the scientists. Oh, now the phone is ringing. Sorry for that. And then on the other hand, we have co-production as shorthand for the proposition I'm sorry, I'm sorry, one moment. Sorry, not very professional, but I couldn't turn it off. So, and on the other hand, we have co-production as shorthand for the proposition that the ways in which we know and represent the world, both nature and society, of course, are inseparable from the ways in which we choose to live in. I think this is really important. We should never think that science is something detached from what we actually do and where we live. Science is always a part of how we make the world, how we realize the world that we are going to live in. And so this is also a very good motto for us. There are several core principles, which are listed here on this slide. One is what we call participant ownership. The participants do not only take part in the design, but they also take on responsibilities. Then openness and reflexivity is really, really important. Input should be always balanced, and representation should be guaranteed also in terms of diversity and inclusion. Transformation is a very important principle. So the emphasis is definitely on the identification of lessons learned and improvements of benefits and well-being for all participants. So change, sometimes that is also called change. Flexibility, yeah, that's really important, and sometimes one of the hardest parts, because you have to keep the evaluation design rather flexible, but with that not forget that it has to be systematic, of course. But things change, yeah. Now with Corona, we have seen how fast they can change, and you live suddenly in a very, very different world. So just like participatory action research, also co-evaluation has to remain flexible across and along the project's development. Documentation and transparency. This is really important. This also means giving people the opportunity for feedback, for example. Yeah. So whenever possible and ethically desirable, evaluation procedures should be documented and made accessible to participants or even to a wider public. We'll come back to the limits of that, of course, in a bit. And then the timing. We already said that it has to start as early as possible. There are several steps, of course, that are important just to keep in mind. So you have to think about the co-design of the evaluation strategy in the beginning. Then you have to develop some kind of tools for continuous observation and discussion, kind of monitoring. Then, of course, you need to implement feedback cycles for the necessary adaptations and reporting and structured analysis. This is what we call interpretation. And then, of course, there is this kind of layer that can be called valuation, which means that collaboratively, again, there should be some processes of assessing the value of the outcomes and lessons learned. So yeah, actually, it's quite interesting to see what, for example, practitioners or people involved and participants think about impact indicators that just count academic publications, you know? And it's sometimes quite interesting to discuss this with communities of practice. So now I want to give the word again to my colleagues who will share with you how we do it in CoAct.
Okay, so back to CoAct again. Once again, here the visualization. Remember, we had these 4 different cases where we involved the citizens as co-researchers to address their concerns. And so, how did we do that, or how did we start actually to do that? Could we go to the next slide? Then Okay, so actually we have defined some co-evaluation instruments that go across these 4 different cases. So for instance, we have defined some co-evaluation roadmap. That means that's just like a kind of timeline where we discuss with the different case representatives and so on what is going on in their case, what are they doing, what are they planning, and where can then evaluation come in, where is it important that we consider evaluation as a part of the activities taking place. So this is one important thing that we need, the roadmap, to always remember we have to think about evaluation. We have to consider that in all the steps that we are doing. And then this roadmap also helps us to define how would we come in with evaluation. For instance, when there are the first meetings with the participants, how would evaluation come in now in this already first meetings? So these are the roadmaps. And then we started to work on the indicator matrix. That is what you see here on the slide, where we collected from these first interactions with the different groups of citizen scientists, but also professional researchers and other organizations that are involved. what is their expected output, what are expected intermediate outcomes, and what do they expect in the long term. So this is something that might change during the project, but we start to track this from the very beginning. And on the next slide, we have then developed some very case-specific evaluation instruments where every case then can choose what would best fit in the specific case. So we have some qualitative data and quantitative data collection instruments that we have described, and that will give us like a set of instruments to choose from during the process. Okay, next slide.
Yes, and actually talking about the evaluation instruments has been, this part is of course a challenge, as Katja was saying. If we take this co-evaluation approach seriously, as we defined it earlier on, we would like to have everyone also involved, or at least for the co-researchers involved in even defining evaluation instruments, which is hard enough. And so we are approaching this at the moment on the one hand with reflecting on them, on the very objectives, on the goals of what should be assessed and impact, moving also to online instruments for this co-reflection. And this is just an example here that we, in one of the workshops, we are using a Padlet to also collect jointly with the participants the objectives, as we said, and what's the intended impact they expect to be. But not only what did we want to be to include them in online activities, we were also thinking about our target groups and working with them. I had the feeling that also still, although we have COVID-19 and we can't meet face to face, we would like to have some physical objects as well, something haptic, something part of the research that is again entering their physical space. And so for one of the cases, we decided a research diary where we include individual reflection sheets. So compared to the collective experience we collected online, for example, in this case here, we also collect individual feedback and reflect and trigger people to reflect on the process in these research diaries that were sent to them. And in the next one, next slide, please. Just to reflect a little bit also about what action we had to take when co-evaluation was suddenly also influenced, by the whole context, that the situation that we live in today with COVID-19 and physical meetings and physical interactions, physical interventions being completely reduced or almost taken away from us, while we had a lot of the co-evaluation activities planned as such, and actually they're very important for trust building, for this collaboration that we envision together with our co-researchers. So this moving from this physical space to the more digital space had also quite a lot of effects on our projects, not even on the research topic itself, because even the social concerns that we are dealing with here, they have been affected by COVID. And so it's something that couldn't be ignored. So we can't just continue the project we wanted it to be. And there, the flexibility that Katja was mentioning before comes very strongly in again. The research process itself, we had to, for example, the way we collect input, we have to consider maybe is there a gender bias in women taking traditionally more, again, the part of taking care of the kids at home. You can't just assume that everybody has the same time available then in these online meetings. Or digital literacy, when working with certain groups, you have to consider in how far do they have access, do they have the skills to use these digital tools, or even new stakeholders came up when moving to the digital world. And with COVID itself affecting our cases, we even had to bring in new stakeholders on board. And as we said, there are a lot of flexibility has been so far had to be put into this process, and we're still continuing to do it. So actually, I would hand over to Katja again to also outline these our limitations, as I already addressed a little bit, and what we have still in terms of open questions.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Barbara. So I think it's already clear that co-evaluation is quite laborious and takes a lot of effort and care, but it's even more difficult when everything moves to digital worlds and we cannot meet in person, because a lot of trust that is needed for this kind of activities is of course built by social relationships, by face-to-face meetings. And it's quite hard to build this kind of relationship among the participants and all the people in a project with these digital tools that are available to us at the moment. So there are a lot of open questions and limits, and we just picked some of them, of course, here, which also fit very well to the problems that we are facing in today's crisis. So we have to be really, really strict about data privacy regulations, and this is really important if you want to stay true to your own morals and ethics. So language issues is also harder when you can't be on the ground and everything is kind of distributed through countries, over borders, and so on. Then, of course, there's a lot of problems with the term evaluation itself. So sometimes we will not use the term because there is this misconception of evaluation as being evaluated. So people think they are then assessed whether their performance is all right or something like that. So even the term has its problems, and I'm sure you are familiar with that. And then, of course, there are the project dynamics that Barbara just brought up, like the uncertainty of the next weeks to come, and the necessary flexibility. And last but not least, one of the biggest hurdles sometimes is that you have to design these co-evaluation processes very, very like carefully, because if you do too much, you're just overloading everybody, not only the co-researchers, but also the team of a project. So responsibilities have to be carefully distributed, and this is why it's so important to openly speak about this already in the project design with the different stakeholder groups and communities of practice. There are a lot of resources that are now also starting to share information on similar topics, and we collected them for you, some of them, and we collect further. I don't go into detail here. You'll find it then in the documentation of the seminar. But as you can see, there is a lot of questions, open questions, and some of them I think we will tackle now in the upcoming panel discussion with our dear guests. And I just want to put on the board here some of the questions that we think are important, and those were also the questions that we asked the speakers on the panel to think about. So what are your experiences in designing an evaluation strategy, maybe even co-designing it together with stakeholders? Have you done so already at the beginning of a project, or when did you do it, and what were the benefits and the challenges for you? Were they connected to the temporality of when the design happened, or when this was initiated? And do you have any experiences with alternative methods, open evaluation, peer interviews, diaries, as Teresa has also talked about, storytelling and so on? So we would be really, really interested in that.